Hello, everybody. I think we're ready to start. I hope you are all safe and well. My name is Peter Maravelis, and on behalf of City Lights Booksellers, I'd like to welcome you to City Lights Live, the virtual reading series that continues in the footsteps of our in-store calendar and that began during the shelter-in-place. We continue to celebrate the works of authors we know and love with readings, discussions, forums throughout the month of July and into August. It has been 16 weeks since the lockdown was imposed. We're happy to say that City Lights has finally reopened its doors to the public. Following CDC and San Francisco Health Department guidelines, we aim to make our reopening as safe as possible for everyone. So please do come and visit us. You'll once again be able to browse our stacks. Our business hours will be 7 days a week from 12 noon to 8 p.m. We are very excited about reopening, and we've worked very hard to transform the store and make it more conducive to the age of COVID. Our entrance is now on the Broadway side of the building, which is actually 271 Columbus. The original entrance is now an exit only. We do encourage you, of course, to please wear a mask while visiting. As many of you know, City Lights is a publishing house as well as a bookstore. We continue to publish books in the grand tradition of Lawrence Ferlinghetti's Pocket Poet series. We just released a new collection of poetry from Ollie Warren. We also have forthcoming poetry coming in the fall. These include 2 new titles in the Spotlight series, Uchi Naduka, and then one from Sophia Dalin. We also have a new book coming out from the former poet laureate of the U.S., Juan Felipe Herrera. We're very excited about that. We also publish a fair amount of nonfiction exploring issues of the day, including celebrating progressive views. We've published books this year about Julian Bond, Mumia Abu-Jamal, Sam Cox, a young adult book about the life of civil rights activist Bayard Rustin, and much, much more. So to learn about the books that we publish, as well as the books that we carry in the store, please do check them all out on our website at www.citylights.com. And you can also subscribe to our newsletter and get updates about events like this one and all the great books that we carry. So tonight, it is a great pleasure to have with us Ben Ehrenreich. We've had the pleasure of hosting him in the past. We are great fans of his writing here at City Lights and most excited to be celebrating this new book. This is actually the kickoff party. We're very, very honored. And it's called Desert Notebooks, a roadmap for the end of time. It's published by our friends over at Counterpoint Press. Desert Notebooks is really a whirlwind of prose and scholarship. It layers concepts from literature, climate science, mythology, nature writing, personal insights, geopolitics, and much, much more. Using the American Southwest as a backdrop, Ben explores the crisis of our time. He thinks about not just our relationship to the idea of apocalypse, but our relationships to each other, to fellow creatures, to plants, to minerals, the landscape, bringing us into a kind of a longer view of our connection to the universe. So before we begin, a few words about Ben. I mean, he's an award-winning writer whose work has appeared in Harper's and the New York Times Magazine, the London Review of Books, and the Los Angeles Magazine. He writes about climate change regularly for The Nation magazine. In 2011, he was awarded a National Magazine Award. His last book, The Way to the Spring, A Life and Death in Palestine, based on his reporting from the West Bank, was one of the UK Guardian's best books of 2016. He's also the author of 2 novels, Ether and The Suitors. So you may actually purchase copies of tonight's title via the link that appears at the center part of your screen. The way we're going to proceed tonight, Ben is going to give a talk about his book, and it's going to be followed by a Q&A. So we encourage you all to use the Ask a Question function that's at the bottom of your screens to pose the questions. Ben's going to be using that to pick out the questions from that window. So Ben, it is such a pleasure to have you with us. Welcome to City Lights Live.
Thank you, Peter. It's great to be here. This is pretty weird, people. I can see from the little icons on the side that a lot of people I know and love are out there. Hello. I was hoping I'd be able to see your little faces floating around in a little grid, and I can't see your faces. Well, anyway, it's great to know you're there. I am one of you, Seshu. It was Seshu. Commented on the irony of having to launch Desert Notebooks, this book, on this extremely ethereal platform. And he is certainly correct. It is a book which is very much about place and what it means to be grounded in place. And I'm in England, on another continent from you guys, doing this book event through City Lights Books in San Francisco. I have no idea where you guys are. I hope you're healthy and well wherever you are. Here it's 2 a.m, so if I start repeating the same sentence again and again and again, I don't know, there's nothing you can do. Maybe if you collectively hit your computers on the side, I'll wake up and snap out of it. But thank you for giving this talk a chance, and this platform a chance, and this book a chance, and for doing it through City Lights, which I can't begin to say how happy I am that through all of this, City Lights still exists and is still out there. And I can't encourage you enough, if you're in any position to do so, to please buy a copy of my book tonight, and to buy it through City Lights. And buy every other book you want and need through City Lights as well. I'm sure you have read with as much outrage as I have about the unconscionable billions that Jeff Bezos has been squeezing out of his workers throughout this crisis. And this is your chance to buy books through a beloved institution that does not send him a penny. So click that button. Well, I'm going to talk to you about Desert Notebooks for about half an hour, and then we can, you can type little questions, and I will try to answer your little questions. Your big questions, they'll look little on my screen. Desert Notebooks is not like any other book I've written before. It is probably not like a whole lot of books you've read before. As the title suggests, it's about the desert, but also, as the subtitle suggests, it's about time and the end of time and the shapes that time takes and why we experience it the way we do. It's also a book about writing and what value writing might have in a world that seems to be falling apart, that is falling apart. And along the way, it touches, among many other things, on the overthrow of the Quiche Maya Lords of the Dead, the overthrow of the Quiche Maya themselves, the feminist archaeologist Maria Gimbutas, progress as a theory of white supremacy, the racism at the root of Hegel's concept of history, the figure of Lilith as she appears on ancient Babylonian tablets, in the Kabbalistic literature, and in 19th century novels, paintings, and verse, Jorge Luis Borges' obsession with prison cells, the great northern Paiute prophet Wovoka and the massacre at Wounded Knee, petroglyphs, Las Vegas stars, the maddening arrogance of Claude Lévi-Strauss, the lonely death of Walter Benjamin, the 17th century shoemaker and mystic Jacob Burma, and the great 19th century insurrectionist Louis-Auguste Blanqui, the Chemehuevi god Coyote's 4 penises, and especially his sky penis, which was so big that he was able to dress it in the skin of an old woman, and many, many owls. Lots of owls. I started writing this book, God, it seems both like yesterday and many years ago. But it was late in 2017, a little more than a year after the election of the current president. I know this year has been a weird one and a painful one, but that one, if you remember, was also weird and painful. I'm sure you remember the dizzying, nauseating pace of the crises, the revelations, the outrages, the scandals, a new horror every day. Sometimes it seemed like more than one, sometimes it was more than one. And in the United States, we were not used to that yet. We were just beginning to get used to it, even to get exhausted by it, when the coronavirus hit, and time seemed to break down again. But in those days, it felt very fresh. Not only political certainties, but our very grip on time itself seemed to be slipping away. And I tell the story in the first chapter of the book. I was living in Joshua Tree in California, in the Mojave Desert, and I went out on a hike with 2 friends, and I'll read you a little bit from the book. Summer had passed, the monsoons had poured down in September, and though no rain had fallen since, the senna and brittlebush were still in bloom, smearing the sides of the wash brilliant yellow. I don't remember what we were talking about, maybe Steve Bannon or the Lost Hikers, or Roy Moore, banned from the mall. Remember that? Or the elusive scent of the desert willows that thicketed the floor of the wash, when Kay, walking ahead of A and me, stopped. She pronounced a single word: owls. They took to the air in a sudden, rustling burst, and then went silent. I barely glimpsed the first one, a flash of wide white wings as it glided by above us, too big a thing to be so quiet. It soared off in a broad arc and disappeared behind a hill to the west. The second one, though, passed low enough that for an instant I could see that flat, tawny face, the mottled white and brown plumage of its belly, those bright, alien eyes. It circled once and flew out of sight to the east. Eventually, we breathed. With all their circling and swooping, Kay thought maybe there had been 3 of them, but I was fairly sure there had been just 2. We kept walking, the wash narrowing as we went, until we had to scramble over boulders to proceed. We turned a bend. The owls were there, perched on a rock. They saw us first and flew off up the canyon. Again, they separated, one arcing right, the other left. We thought that was it and picked up the conversation again. I know at some point we talked about Lebanon and Saudi Arabia, Saad Hariri's strange flight to Riyadh, Jared Kushner's visit the week before. All of that had filled me with a panic that lasted for days, the contours of the next global conflict revealing themselves, requiring only the smallest flame. Who would play the role of the Archduke this time? Who would kill him? Kay stopped again. The owls had roosted in the rocks ahead of us, as if they were waiting for us there. They flew off again, and again we watched in silence. We saw them 5 times in all, maybe 6, before they soared off into some more distant canyon and disappeared for good. I knew that we'd been annoying them, that they were only trying to avoid us, and it's foolish, I know, but this is what humans do. We turn the world into a story and put ourselves into the center of the plot. And I found it hard not to imagine, or want to believe, that they'd been leading us onward all along, that they were trying to tell us something, or to show us a path, one that led deeper into the wilderness, away from the highway, away from the car. Before we said goodbye that night, in the parking lot of the town's one Indian restaurant, the conversation turned to writing. A and K are both writers. It was getting harder, we agreed, to muster any faith in any of it, to care at all about lit world battles that had once seemed so important, or even in the face of real planetary disaster, glaciers melting, oceans rising, droughts and fires and famines and floods, to care about something we'd once confidently called literature. No matter how pointless things may have felt at any given moment, A said, you could always tell yourself that you were taking part in a conversation, an exchange that stretched back into the immeasurable past and on into a future that you couldn't yet imagine. That was the conceit. Not progress, but continuity at least. You could tell yourself that it was the conversation that mattered. This stream of voices flowing through the centuries, this ancient, almost sacred thing that is bigger and deeper than any of us alone. But what if it's going to end soon? What if someone, in a generation, perhaps 2, will write the very last word? What if the future does not include enough human beings to keep the conversation going? What if it drifts off like a party at the end of the night, with only a few drunks left mumbling in the corners? What if the humans who remain are too busy surviving to tend to the books and the servers? What if literacy has a horizon and it's near? Isn't it all just noise then? That should give you a little bit of an idea of what's at stake in this book and what is, I think, at stake for all of us. And it may sound grim, but strangely enough, at the time, that conversation didn't feel in the slightest bit grim. And I don't believe that, despite its topic, that this book is either. I'm going to read you a tiny bit more. I should add that we were laughing, or smiling at least. Really, I mean it. We were talking about the end of time, and the increasingly probable destruction of everything we knew and loved. We didn't relish any of it, but in the context of the walk we had just taken, time took a different shape. The desert enforces its own perspective. It shrinks you and puts eternity in the foreground. If you're open to it, and you don't mind a diminished role in this drama, it insists quietly on the surging beauty of all things and non-things, living and dead, and not formally alive. And then something even stranger happened. something that I still think about a lot. I drove home that night feeling this almost ecstatic sense of gratitude. And a lot of you out there know me well enough to know I'm not somebody who walks around with an almost ecstatic sense of gratitude. Though I didn't know at the time what exactly it was that I felt so goonily thankful for. I went to bed that night, I woke up, I worked on whatever I was working on, and a week or so later, I was still thinking about this walk and those owls, so I sat down to write about it, more or less as a journal entry, to make sure I didn't forget it and to kind of warm myself up before going back to the novel I was then working on. I basically kept writing for the next 12 months, and that's an exaggeration, but only a small one. I never went back to that novel. Instead, I wrote what became Desert Notebooks. And the process of writing it was also throughout a process of reading and of writing as I read. Those owls sent me to the Quiche Maya text, the Popol Vuh, in which owls play a role, and then to Borges and to Hegel and Benjamin and Ovid and the Greek myths and the stories told by the people of the Mojave, the Chemehuevi, the Serrano, the Mojave, the Odom, and later to the extraordinary work of a scholar named Martin Bernal, which is about the way European scholars in the 18th and 19th centuries scrubbed their understanding of ancient Greek civilization, of its links to and roots in Africa and Asia, and constructed thereby an ethnically cleansed mythology of Western origins, what we refer to when we talk about this thing, Western civilization. And when people talk these days about Western civilization, which unfortunately do with increasing frequency, and about white Americans as inheritors of the glories of Western civilization, as Trump did in his comically terrifying speech this last week at Mount Rushmore, it is to precisely that ethnically cleansed and entirely fictional mythology that they're referring to. And my investigations about time, I began to understand, were not just about any experiential sense that time was breaking down, but they were about that too, but about understanding the roots of this mythology. And my investigations were about also a politics of time, about how time functioned as an ideological instrument, because I realized time had history too. Time existed within time. And the factors that shape our perception of time, mainly the rise of capitalism and of theories and structures of racial hierarchy and white supremacy, are the very same factors driving the multiple crises that are spiraling around us, including the pandemic, distorting our sense of time, pushing everything towards collapse, towards something that looked a lot like, and still looks a lot like, the end of time. It's really hard to avoid using that word when you start to become conscious of it. But of course, time doesn't end. And if this all sounds a bit too abstract as a way of understanding this, I'm going to read a little more from a later section of the book, if I can find it. Until recently, in Europe, time lazed past according to the rhythms of the plow and the scythe, the wheel of the saints' days, and the opportunities for rest and carousal that accompanied them. For all but a minuscule literate elite, the years passed without number. Churches did not trouble to record the years of births, baptisms, and marriages until the 16th century. Common people's lives were ruled by neither days nor hours. The church bells would ring for matins. I had to look that up. I've never spoken that word aloud before. But the church bells would ring for matins and vespers, but no further demarcation of the time was necessary or even possible. Mechanical clocks only began to appear on church towers in the 14th century, and then only in cities and towns. For the next 400 years, it would have made little sense to slice an hour into smaller bits. Most clocks didn't even have minute hands. If the need arose, time could be subdivided into commonly understood and distinctly human-sized quantities, the time it takes to mow a field of grain, say, or to recite an Our Father, or to urinate. An interval known as a pissing while made it into Shakespeare's Two Gentlemen of Verona, as in, he had not been there, bless the mark, a pissing while, but all the chamber smelt him. Over the course of the 17th century, more accurate clocks began to proliferate, and eventually to migrate from town squares and cathedral belfries into the drawing room of the gentry. In another 50 years, technology, and specifically the development of the balance spring and regulator, allowed clocks to miniaturize without any sacrifice in accuracy and to take refuge in the pockets of an emerging class of merchants and manufacturers. In 1687, 10 years after the invention of the balance spring, Isaac Newton elevated time in an extraordinary fashion, defining it as an absolute and independent force that progressed at a consistent rate regardless of who was perceiving it, or if it were perceived at all. Even if the universe were entirely empty, time would tick on, echoing through the void like God's very pulse. And why not? Any mortal with sufficient income to spare could by then carry time around with them, trapping it in a compact silver case, embossed perhaps with golden stars. Whether its owner was awake or asleep, alive or dead, it would tick and talk for eternity, unless they neglected to wind it. By 1760, the personal timepiece had become sufficiently widespread that a British satirist would complain that "Sir, will you have your clock wound up?" had become the common expression of streetwalkers. Over the course of the next century and a half, time, once the property of none and all, would belong to the rich and the powerful, first to the factory owners, then the railway magnates, then to the politicians and military men, divvied up according to the needs of capital and conquest. Technology, the British historian E.P. Thompson observed, was never the decisive factor. Though the key horological innovations had occurred decades earlier, the general diffusion of clocks and watches in England did not take place until the 1970s, Thompson wrote, at the exact moment when the Industrial Revolution demanded an exact synchronization of labor. Large-scale industrialization, Thompson argued, had reconfigured labor. Workers who had once bartered their skills or their strength now hired out their time. They were paid by the day or the hour rather than the task or the piece. In a very literal sense, time became money. It became something wholly abstract, something independent of our bodies, of the circulation of our blood and the transit of our thought and desires. It could be used or misused, spent or wasted, even stolen. Moments of inactivity were suddenly transformed into something that would have been nonsensical a few years earlier, a theft of time that vigilant managers strived to guard against. The ironworks in Swalwell in northeast England, which was for a little while the largest factory in Europe, was the first to employ a monitor tasked with noting every worker's arrivals and departures to the minute, and with guarding the clock to prevent workers from setting it forward or back, or presumably destroying it. Power over time had become power over labor, which is to say, over people. It was at the same moment, which was also the moment of revolutionary upheaval in France and in Haiti, of Condorcet's frenzied ode to human progress, and by many measures the beginning of the modern era, that with the development of the coal-powered steam engine, the industrializing societies of Europe and North America began releasing sufficient carbon dioxide to eventually alter the climate of the Earth. It was then, too, that the stars began to disappear from the skies of the cities and towns of Europe and North America, and from the consciousness of their inhabitants, smeared away by the smoke of all those factories and by the glow of the gas lamps that in the early decades of the 1800s were beginning to illuminate the streets of European capitals. It was then that time got inside us. But this is also a book about the desert, and the desert told me something very different about time. I'd moved to Joshua Tree from Los Angeles in 2016, just a few weeks after the election, which was coincidental, but it turned out to be a very good moment for a major shift in consciousness, which is what the desert can give you, and what it gave me. Very quickly living there, your sense of time shifts. Not much happens in the course of a day, but at the same time, a lot does. The wind blows, and you know it's the wind, and the rain and the slow trickle and sometimes the sudden rush of water through the rocks that over millennia have shaped the landscape all around you. You see and feel the rhythms of the seasons, the heat and the cold and the rain, and you see and feel and hear and smell how other living things, lots of living things, respond to these changes, blossoming and opening themselves when there is water enough, shutting themselves down and hiding themselves away when there is not. And you begin to understand that talking about time and thinking about time is just another way of talking about life, which has rhythms of its own, if you care to listen. The stars come out at night, and over the course of a few weeks, or months or years, you can watch the sky change and gain a sense of time that is wider still. I'm going to read one more short section, going back to the beginning of the book, about the desert. Not everyone likes the desert. I've loved it since the first time I came out here alone. Not to Joshua Tree that time, but farther north and east to Death Valley. This was 18 years ago. I had messed up my life in a number of ways that at the time felt irreparable. Being young and overly literal, I decided to head for the lowest spot in the hemisphere. I drove out from LA, wrapped a scarf around my head, and walked out beneath the brutal sun over the salt flats in Badwater Basin. The earth was cracked and crusted white, the heat quivering above it. I doubt I brought much water. I didn't make it to the very lowest point. It was too hot. And walking out there, the salt crackling beneath my boots, I started laughing and couldn't stop. Mainly at myself, but at everything else too. The misery, the sense of failure that had sat on my shoulders for months just lifted off, pulverized by pure absurdity. I remember finding insects that had died there and had been encrusted with white crystals of salt, little jeweled crickets. I put a couple in my pocket and didn't feel bad about turning around. I stayed in Death Valley for a day or two longer and can't remember ever feeling so free. Later, years later, I would rent a cabin in Joshua Tree for a month or two each year and come out to write. My ex had lived there before, and she teased me at first. City boy, you'll be running back before a week is up. It turned out that the solitude and silence suited me, and the clarity of the light. Sometimes I came alone for weeks at a time. I didn't even want to drive into town to buy groceries. When work forced me to Los Angeles, and really, I loved LA, I raced back to the desert as soon as I was done. The moment I got off the interstate and headed up the grade and over the mountains, I would roll down the windows and sniff at the air like a dog, and feel the tension sliding down my spine. I grew up in the New York suburbs, and my people are originally from cloudy, low-skied lands, Scotland, Ireland, Poland, Ukraine, but I had never been anywhere where I felt so immediately at home. Some people have the opposite response. My godmother and her partner came down to visit once from San Francisco. Her partner was probably 60 at the time, was overcome with joy the first time we took him to the park, the national park, that is. He turned into a little boy, scrambling over boulders, his eyes enormous, his face transformed. But my godmother felt uneasy and exposed. Everything was sharp. There was too much death around. She missed the nurturing embrace of leafy green plants. Moisture, abundance. Other friends have had the same reaction. It's not an aesthetic aversion so much as an existential allergy. They feel dread, something approaching panic. They see only emptiness and the bare cruelty of nature, though the forest and the coast are no less cruel. I tried to explain that what I saw around me was not just death, but right next to it, sharing the same space, the urgency, brilliance, and stubbornness of life. You couldn't always see it and never would if you didn't look, but everything was alive. Even the rocks and the dirt were alive. I don't mean that in some mystical sense, or not only in that sense. A cryptobiotic crust of microorganisms, bacteria, lichens, mosses, algae, fungi, covers the desert floor, an invisible web of fibrous tentacles that allows the soil to absorb the rain and resist the wind, sheltering the roots of plants and the animals that tunnel and burrow down there, protecting everything that skitters beneath the surface of the scene. Lichens splash the rocks with brilliant greens, yellows, reds. Life thrums through this place like a current, coursing through matter that is anything but inert. I guess I'll wrap up by suggesting, and if you have questions, we can talk more about this, that what I experienced in the desert, I also found everywhere I looked in human history and everywhere around me. That magic pulsing force, life surging forth even in the darkest spots, the ones in which we assume that only death exists and barrenness. It can be tempting from our vantage point, especially perhaps after spending a few months alone on lockdown in your apartment. It can be tempting from this precipice on which we sit, contemplating the daily death counts, the latest extinction news, the latest police murders, the rising temperatures in the Arctic, and the rising strength of the fascists that now control the governments of 4 of the 10 largest countries on the planet. It can be tempting to look behind us and around us and see only the disasters, the genocides, all the catastrophes on which this current catastrophe sits. Walter Benjamin famously described the angel of history as being propelled backwards blindly into the future, still facing the past. Where we perceive a chain of events, Benjamin writes, he sees one single catastrophe which keeps piling wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. And history is that. Anyone who pays attention to it knows that. But I think Benjamin also knew that it is not just that. In the same essay, he wrote about what he called the time of now, by which he meant to point, I think, towards a more voluminous understanding of the present that includes all of the past and all possible futures within it, that is pregnant with them in every fraction of every moment, a notion of time that is writhing and ready to burst with what it carries. And to help blast that open was, in Benjamin's understanding, a revolutionary act and our only hope of salvation. This was not for Benjamin, and it isn't for me, a philosophical or religious task, one that can be completed alone through contemplation or meditation or self-care. It is and must be a political act, a collective act, one that we perform together. I've been thinking a lot these last few years about all of these strange and uncanny ways in which in which the past seems to be breaking through into the present. The permafrost melting, revealing the bones of creatures long extinct, drought revealing the ruins of ancient structures in Iraq and Spain and the UK, Nazis and all the other buried ghosts of history on the march again. It's been exciting, to use a word that is completely inadequate to the emotion, these last weeks to see people taking to the streets all over the US and then all around the world to stand up against injustices that are at once centuries old and all too current. And in the very same moment and the same movement, to fight openly on behalf of the dead, of our ancestors, toppling monuments that glorify the crimes on which the current order is built. The past makes demands with the same breath the future does. It always has. But too many of us ignored them for too long. We can't anymore. I don't believe that this is entirely something to be frightened of. I believe we've arrived at a reckoning. It is time now. I hope this book helps to clarify what is at stake in this for all of us, and to remind us of the strength and love that we will need to proceed. Thank you. So thus concludes the part of this where I just talk, and now begins the part of this where you can ask questions. And I see one person has typed a question, and if you look in the bottom of your screen, it should say ask a question, and somebody's already asked one. Okay, it's Stacy, who said, you've addressed this a bit, but did this book begin as a journal entry? Do I keep a journal? Yes and yes. I mean, I keep one really sporadically and lazily, and not with any real discipline. And every now and again, something happens that makes me remember that I ought to. And this walk that I described, which was actually with Anthony McCann and Kirsty Singer, who may even be out there tonight, was one of those things that made me think I should write this down, because I'll just forget this, because I forget everything. And I think, like a lot of writers, I also keep a journal because it helps you to, when you do sit down to write things you want to write about, it helps you to figure out how to write them. And this one certainly did that. This one actually became a book. Are there any other questions out there? There's no other questions yet. Who has questions? Doop-de-doop-de-doo. Somebody asked a question. You're probably all busy buying books. Busy clicking those links and buying books. Hello, hello.
So Ben, could you talk a little bit about how you put the book together, like that physical process?
Yeah, so I wrote it. I didn't write it necessarily in the order that it appears in the book, although pretty close to it. But at a certain point, I was writing about whatever was obsessing me at that moment, and each obsession was leading to a new obsession, to a new obsession, to a new obsession. And I was just sort of somehow gave myself the permission to write about it as I was going. And so I would write a section about the Popol Vuh, I'd write a section about Maria Gimbutas or Walter Benjamin or whatever. And at a certain point, I realized that this was going to be insane unless I figured out some real structure to pin these on. And for a little while, I was actually, I made these complex sort of system of, it sounds like I was building a bridge, but I was not. A very complex and sophisticated engineering system of index cards, which I taped to the wall. I had a fellowship for a semester in Las Vegas at the Black Mountain Institute, and this book would not have been possible without that, and without the time that fellowship gave me and the generosity of the people there. And they gave me an office. I mean, this is all a writer wants, is a place to write and access to books. And I had something that, as a writer outside of academia, that I never have, and it was this extraordinary luxury. I had a library card to an academic library, the library at UNLV, which was wonderful. And I kept producing and kept reading and kept writing, and then one wall of my office at UNLV started to become covered with these strange little index cards with my own weird, intricate writing in them. And people would, occasionally pop in and look in and say, "What is that?" Then they'd read what I was writing and stop asking questions. But yeah, so it was a long process, and then there were, of course, a number of edits once it was done.
Well, we got some more questions. Actually, quite a few here.
All right.
Let's see. Was Edward Abbey an influence?
Edward Abbey was not an influence. I've read Edward Abbey's desert writings, and this is going to be heretical, but I don't love them. I think I started reading them only after I'd started writing this book. So no, he wasn't. I think there's a lot that I do appreciate about Edward Abbey's work, but there's a certain machismo to his attitude towards the desert and towards nature that was very much of its moment, but that I didn't find helpful in how I was thinking about things and wanted to relate to things. Let's see what else we got. Go ahead, so Peter, sorry.
Oh, no, I was going to just probably pick out, there's quite a bit here now. How do you think your or our understanding of time changes with age, category, gender, and location?
Oh, God. It changes all the time. And I think one of the things that pushed me to write this book was that while it changes for all of us individually, only occasionally does something happen where it changes for all of us at once, where our collective experience of time shifts. And I think that's something that's certainly happening now and has been happening for the last few months since the pandemic began. And people have been writing about that and talking about that. Time certainly changes when you're locked inside and have time to think about things you don't want to think about. But I think during those early months of the of the Trump administration, especially when it was just like we were getting sort of smacked by one horror after another in a way that we really weren't used to in the U.S. That for a lot of people, time seemed to be shifting. And for me, what it reminded me of was, a couple of years before this, I'd been living in the West Bank, and during a particularly bad period in the months leading up to the Gaza war, I'd also felt time shifting in this way and kind of changing its shape, and the straight line of time that we kind of take for granted. It does the same thing every day. It can be divided into these further subdivisions. It moves ahead. This ceased to exist, and suddenly time was this labyrinthine thing which had all these secret and horrible rooms in it, most of which you didn't want to get stuck in. And I think something happened like that in 2017 and 2016, and something like that is happening again.
Here's another one. The passages about Las Vegas and your semi-cloistered time there and your avoidance of the crowds feel sort of shockingly prescient. Has that surprised you?
Yeah, I was enough of a hermit even before the pandemic began. Vegas is a really weird town, and it presents one face to the world, and it has a lot of other faces too. And I wasn't there long enough to get a very sophisticated or, I think, very deep, sense of that place. But I think in the months that I was there, my sense of it was profoundly different from the one that it presents to the world. And it was a city that felt abandoned, that felt empty. And the only people in the street, it's like a lot of Western cities, it's a vehicular city. And I think having lived in LA and spent a lot of time in the Southwest, I thought, oh, Vegas is going to be a piece of cake. But Vegas is something different. And the part of town I was staying in, there was no one in the streets at all for the most part, but the occasional lost tourist and a lot of, really desperately poor people with nowhere to go and nowhere to sleep. It felt like the collapse for most of the people there had already occurred. Of course, they've experienced a different kind of collapse these last few months.
Here's another one. In reference to your closing statement, does it seem to you the moment is past, the moment when real change could happen?
Oh, no, not at all. I don't think, I'm not sure if that moment ever passes. But no, not at all. I think we are building towards something, and it's not just the election. I think, there are still protests occurring in many cities around the country. They're not being reported on in quite the same way, and the numbers have gone down a bit, but no, absolutely not. I think one of the things that was most exciting about those protests and maddening that I couldn't be in the US to join them was knowing that not that they're going to achieve, they're going to defund police overnight, but knowing that not only are they completely and radically changing the conversation about police and violence and about race in the US, but for the thousands and thousands and thousands, and maybe it was millions of people who were out in the streets those days, it changes your perspective of what's possible. It changes the size of the possible. It changes your sense of yourself and what you can do in the world to take part collectively in something like that. I think that's one of the great powers of protest. And I think many, 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 many thousands of people who had never experienced that before experienced that together and knew what it meant to stand up and to put your body on the line. And to be beaten down by the cops for it, to take risks with people around you. That's a powerfully transformative experience. And I think people don't let go of that quickly. So yeah, I think this is just beginning.
Here's another question. Is there one action you would recommend above all others to address the crises at hand?
get back in the streets, wear a mask and get in the streets. I think the crises are enormous, and they are bigger than any small beans reforms are going to get us. They're certainly way bigger than Joe Biden is going to be able to tackle, or has shown any interest in tackling. And I think the only way forward is for people to continue to make demands, and it's a question of life and death for all of us.
Well, Ben, this has really been incredible, and congratulations on this book. I'm encouraging you all, please press that button at the center of your screen. City Lights can use the support right now. Buy this book. It's really such an amazing amalgam of just so many different elements, and just so lovingly produced. For those of you who have not subscribed to our newsletter, I encourage you to do so. You'll get to be up on events like this one. There's a whole bunch coming up in the weeks to come. We have Leslie Kern coming up this coming Thursday, celebrating her book called Feminist City from Verso Press. Later in the month, we've got John Nichols and Robert Shear talking about the state of disunion. A Philip Whalen tribute sponsored by Wave Books, and much, much more. You can also keep up with us on social media at Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. This event will be rebroadcast actually at this very site. So if you know someone who missed it, please do send them here. And we look forward to having you all again with us again in the near future. Have an excellent evening. One and all, be safe and well. Ben, thanks again.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks to City Lights for having me. Hit that green button and buy the book. Thank you all for being here. I really hope I can see you people soon in the flesh, and hug you and shake you and all that.
Take care, Ben.
Bye.
Good night, everybody.